acknowledge it, and it has a place in my research and writing. But the way that we today are grappling with those aspects of historic and intergenerational trauma, trying to come back and be healthy and assert ourselves as Chumash, as Indigenous people, despite all of that trauma and all of that suffering that we've endured in this generation and in all of the generations that since 1769, right? So I just want to talk a little bit about the lasting legacies of Serra's grand scheme, rather than the history itself. We have heard a great foundation of the history of the missions. My research looked at the way that the narrative, that fantasy Spanish history and narrative is perpetuated, and how that history, those narratives continue to not only destabilize us, but continue to exacerbate the wound of the legacy of the missions. The fact that they are these celebratory places, these places of gardens and fountains and a very glorified history, I believe serves to continue to exacerbate our wounds, continues to pour salt in those wounds. People don't visit Auschwitz, the Auschwitz Museum, to celebrate its heyday, right? People go to Auschwitz to recognize the suffering that occurred there, honor the ancestors that died there, and the government and the curators, the staff people of that site of conscience work with communities to heal the wounds created by that system, right, under Hitler. Very similar in some ways to the system under Serra that has left these concentration camp sites along the California coast that educate our fourth graders every year, busloads and busloads of our children and our neighbors' children visit these sites to learn about our history. And so it's as if we've given over control to the Nazi regime to tell our story and to educate our children. And I know that this is a harsh comparison, but when we hear about the conditions and we recognize the ongoing legacy of the corrosive nature of separating families and children from their parents, and separating people from their lands that they're so deeply, thousands and thousands of years of roots in those lands, to separate them from those lands, denaturalize them, separate them from their communities, separate them from even their nuclear families, and expect that the descendants of those people are going to be able to thrive in any way is ludicrous, right? And so it's important, if there's ever going to be any healing for those of us within these communities, and healing between us and our neighbors, and healing among us as communities. Like, one of the things that I wrote in my notes this morning as soon as I woke up was, you know, this day and this protest, this set of protests, this work that we're doing in light of the possible canonization of Father Serra needs to be a call to action among our communities to stop fighting with one another and pointing one another out as not belonging or not really who you say you are. All of that ridiculousness continues to corrode the fragile fabric that is our efforts at revitalization and honoring the ancestors, right? So it's a call to action for that, healing within our communities. And reaction to the Catholic Church to honor the notions of the Catholic Church, right? If this is about, if a religion is about God and order and love and all of the things that all of the religions around the world profess to be, to best honor God and to best honor someone who they believe had the very best intentions for us, the best way to honor that idea is to work with us to heal our communities that were ripped apart by the mission system and continue to suffer from this intergenerational trauma. So, I mean, and there are some really specific things that can be done. There were over 1,000 acres that were meant for Indian lands. They were meant for Indian families. And when the missions closed and secularization occurred, none of those lands were given to Indian people. They were sold for profit for the local diocese. They were sold for whatever reasons, but over 1,000 acres that were meant for us, that 3 colonial governments said were going to be left for us, got sold, and we were left landless, right? From the entire, I call it the Indian free zone between San Francisco and San Diego. It's a swath along the coast where the missions were, right? There's no federal recognition where there were missions. And so therefore, that's an ongoing legacy, that's an ongoing serious impact that we are landless and without sovereignty and without any rights in our homeland. And the most important piece of that is that healing of historic trauma has been proven through scholarly research by Native people themselves that in telling our story, and I know this firsthand as a person in 12-step recovery, when I tell my story, I'm healed. When I tell my story, others are able to heal and connect, right? As landless Indians without sovereign status and without lands, and therefore without any place to tell our stories, we're voiceless. We have no way to tell our story. And my dissertation research looks at that, at how along the Central Coast, there are all of these missions and museums telling our story. But they're very different stories than the ones that we actually tell. And so we remain sick. We remain voiceless. And if the church is about what they say they're about, if Pope Francis is the good pope that everyone thinks he is, then honoring an individual is much less powerful than working with a group of people to try to heal the loss, right? And if Serra was really worthy of sainthood, would he rather the individualistic honor of being called a saint, if he was really saintly, or would he really desire for there to be healing in the wake of the mess that the system that he helped create left behind? So it's a bigger question than should we garner this one-man sainthood, but rather think about what does it mean to be a saint, and to do the right thing, what does that look like? And anyways, I had a whole bunch of notes here, a bunch of scholarly things that I was going to share with y'all that I didn't. And so at any point during the day, if you want to chat about the work that I've done or the additional lasting legacies of Serra's big grand scheme, then chat with me at any time. It's really good to be here. I'm honored to be sitting on a panel with such esteemed experts, and thanks for inviting me, Marcus and Chris.
15 minutes, you can't say too much. We're trying to gather these thoughts of these esteemed panelists. Thank you very much. And we see, give her a big hug. Her family and what she's going through right now, and real important to do that. The next person we have is Roberta Cordero, Chumash elder, past chairperson of the Chumash Maritime Association, and a member of our community, Chumash community, and also a member of the coastal band of the Chumash Nation. Roberta.
Thanks, Marcus. I want to first acknowledge and honor my elder here, Pilula Kus. Thank you for coming, Pilula. And all of the people here and all of the ancestors that you bring with you. And I think all of the people who've spoken already, they've said a lot of the things that I might have said, and so now I don't have to say them, so thank you. I think I want to talk just a little bit about historical trauma and its significance here from a personal standpoint. It has been very important to me to understand this phenomenon, and I also want to say, in talking about that, and just a very little because Dr. Schindler will talk more about it this afternoon, but I want to say that the effects of historical trauma are not unique to Indian people. The effects of oppression and violence and I can't even think here, genocide, the people that are the victims of those things suffer the same kinds of things, and they are long-term. In my personal family history, I have both oppressors and oppressed who lived here, and that was something that I had to deal with very early, to be able to embrace that and understand how those people could be important to me. And what I understand finally with that is that people act according to their values. And so if we want to change things, we have to talk about that very basic thing about our values. And that's what we're talking about here. There were so many negative things left by the missions. And this is not to say that people cannot find their spiritual path within the church. I'm not talking about that. People find their way to Creator, their way to Spirit in many different ways. And it's a very personal journey in many ways, mostly that. But the kinds of internalized oppression that we suffer among ourselves is also perpetrated by the local institutions here, by some of them. And so in addressing historical trauma, first what we do is we address the past, and that's what we're doing here. What really happened? You cannot move forward if you don't understand what really happened. And the second part of that is analyzing the present, and that's the ongoing effects. That includes disease, PTSD, ongoing historical trauma effects, well studied by many people. But then you have to build the future. And I see that happening here with cultural revitalization, especially with the deeper understanding of our indigenous maritime culture and all the things that go with that. But it also involves a critical deconstruction of colonialism, and that's also what we're doing here. Very important to understand where your thinking came from and what you really want to value here. And so eventually that means that you have to understand that yes, our peoples were victimized. And then next, yes, they survived. We wouldn't be here if we didn't have some strong survivors in our past. But then to transcend and no longer define ourselves in terms of that trauma is what we're trying to do here. When I was invited to be here, I was in the midst of writing a poem, which I haven't been doing for a long time. I never intended to be a poet, but sometimes when I've journaled, it just kind of popped out. So this is what was happening with me, and I want to end with this. The name of this poem is Levantamiento, Mission Indians. We believed, some of us, in that rosy promise of sweet salvation through the generations of candlelit bead counting, obeying the sure guidance of an all-knowing male priesthood, obscured in clouds of frankincense and papal pronouncements, eyes cast upward to that ineffable patriarch in the sky, who someday, if we were very, very good, we would meet in a rank-ordered heaven, where someday, if we sacrificed and submitted and were enslaved enough, we would join choirs of lily-white angels. We believed, some of us, in that earthy past of sweet living through the generations of fire-lit storytelling, observing the enduring guidance of the elders and experts, honoring all the directions and the wholeness of a tangible creation, so that every day, if we practiced the age-old teachings, if we lived in respect and generosity, our generations would continue forever. We would join our beloved ones in a well-peopled Shimalaksha. And so, disobedient, can you imagine? In great unheralded uprisings, we rose in resistance to the hideous face of genocide. Whipping, rape, shaming, slavery, starvation. Levantamiento. We planned and we ran, fought and bled. We won, some of us, to live again on the beloved land. We lost, most of us, forced once more by the edicts of J. Serra to the brutal salvation that did not save us. Loss and sorrow lodged deep in our communal flesh. And so we resist. Can you imagine? We resist the notion that J. Serra was a holy man, Christ-like, when we hear that Christ was not a man of his times, but a man of compassion, who could protect a woman from stoning, who could heal the wounded and distraught, who could say, by their fruits you shall know them. By your very bitter fruit we do know you, J. Serra. By the violence and devastation perpetrated on people and land, we know you, a man of your times, but not Christ-like, not holy, not a saint. Utter disdain for truth has ripped open the toxic wound, all the agony laid bare in searing light. So we rise, demanding justice for our ancestors, healing for our lands and our peoples. Levantamiento.
I want to underscore what Roberta said. I think it reminds us more is that how do we critically reconstruct this notion of colonialism that we face today? A good question. Next we have the Tia Oros-Peters, Zuni, Executive Director of the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples. Tia.
Good morning. You all slept well. Moshiwi, Zuni, Tia Oros-Peters, Nashina. My name is Tia Oros, and 7th Generation Fund Awan Mosi. I'm the Executive Director of the 7th Generation Fund, and some of you know my people. We're known as the Zuni. We're in the middle of the world, the Diwana, in the center of what's known as North America. In the States, some call New Mexico and Arizona. So to begin with, I would especially like to thank the indigenous peoples of this land, Chumash, for their gracious welcome. That beautiful song, for their welcome of us here onto their traditional territories. Because although we may be here in what some know as Santa Barbara, what some call this building the Unitarian Church, wherever we are, here in Santa Barbara, reaching north, reaching south, reaching east, west, across the ocean, those Channel Islands, we're in Chumash homelands. And I respect that, and thank you for allowing me to be a guest here. Here in this area, Suktun, this area called Suktun, that some call Santa Barbara. But I'm always going to think about it as Suktun. Thank you for the generosity offered to each of us individually and collectively with these words, your songs, your prayers within the embrace of your hearts of these homelands. And as we begin these really difficult days together, as Roberta whispered for a moment as we were listening to some things, never gets any easier to hear these things. Never gets any easier. We're going to talk about some hard issues, challenging issues that evoke lots of pain, and which span centuries, generations, geographies of experience, of thought, of memory, of our consciousness, individual and collective, and which generate dreams and which fuel nightmares. And I'd like to acknowledge also the most important. I think here are the spirits here, the ancestors we brought with us, the spirits here of this place, Chumash country. The ancient, the everlasting, the all-knowing, who saw and see it all. We pay respects to them as well. And I'm deeply aware of their presence with us as we're talking about these things, as we bring them up with these conversations. I'd like to also thank the other panelists for what they shared and what they will share, and the organizers of this event. So Marcus mentioned we're creating history with this dialogue, and some other people touched on that too, and in these activities over this weekend. And that's a great responsibility, and I share these words with you, holding that responsibility. I think also of this in the context of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Marcus had wanted me to mention that. It's an international human rights instrument, and I stood in this room a number of years ago, a few occasions, talking about that human rights instrument, the UN Declaration, that many of you know, some of you may not. But I urge you to find out about it. I actually have a copy here. Because it's a human rights instrument, and it gives us really just the minimum standard of our rights. So there's an article in it, Article 13, and it says, Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, literatures, designate them and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. Okay, so what does that mean? So in essence, it's saying that we have the right to tell our own stories. We have a right to tell these in our own words, in our own languages, emanating from our own identities, our own experiences, and our own perspectives. And that this is our right as an expression of self-determination. Because if we are self-actualized Indigenous peoples, if we are self-determined Indigenous peoples, then we cannot accept what an external oppressor tells us who we are, where we're going, where we've been, what our future is, what is our destiny. We have to claim and exercise our sovereignty. We can't expect someone to give it to us. As my dear sister Deborah Sanchez said, it's an inside job. We have to do it ourselves. We have to describe and define our own realities and our own futures. And that takes courage, and it takes heart, and it takes patience. And it may take time, and it's a process, and it is a process of decolonization. Because don't get me wrong, I don't think we're talking about anything else but that. That's what this discussion is really about, and that's why it's historic. Here in Chumash country, in Suktun today. We're a diverse group, all of us here in this room. And although we may be mostly speaking English, we may not all share the same meaning for the same words or the same phrases. Our perspectives, our perceptions, our life experiences, our memories, and those of our families, those of our ancestors, those that reside within us, our blood memory, our genetic knowledge. These shape and define our understanding of the same words and give us a different interpretation of what's being said here. So words like decolonization and re-indigenization, words like Christianity and Catholicism, words like the mission system, words like priest, God, pain, anguish, words like whips and chains, words like captive, rape, savage, predator, and prey. As we move together through this process, we will need patience and focus to strive for that common goal in this discussion of disrobing. That's the name of this day, disrobing. And what that means is to speak truth, to reveal truth, to explore truth, and to accept it, to truly begin to disrobe this issue, to undo what has been done, to heal, to remember and not to pretend otherwise. How they came here, in 1,000 other places also, how they came here. In robes, para robar. In robes, para robar. To loot, to rob, to break, to plunder. The term itself, robe, those long loose garments we know are worn by priests since the 13th century. That word comes from an old French term, and also from an old Germanic source, including terms like ruba, that refer to plunder, spoils, and sustenance, coming from the notion of garments that they would tear off the bodies of their enemies, like a spoil of war. And it's also derived from other dialects, words like rabo and ru, which also refer to booty or loot, related to robbery and breaking. These are terms from which rob and also the robe come from. That is their DNA. That is their lineage. Para robar. Years ago, I was told by a wisdom keeper, a trusted elder from another Indigenous nation, that his people had a story, a long ago story about how evil came to this continent. It was a teaching, and then they passed it down, and he told it to me. He said how they came from across the ocean, and they brought with them this evil. It was a human leg bone. It had rotting flesh, and it was wrapped in the skin of another being. And that bone and that flesh, he said, it's still here. It's still being used. And we're seeing its negative effects on all of our peoples ever since its arrival, hundreds of years ago. And we know that there's always been negative energy. All of our peoples have known that. That in all things where there's positive, there's negative. There's always that balance, that struggle. It's a core understanding of Indigenous peoples, especially here in the Native world, where there's always the striving for equilibrium, the striving for balance, that motion is constantly in action. So I knew this, that I knew that what he was saying, that this was a different kind of evil, that he was talking about the kind of evil that upsets world order. He was talking about the kind of evil that upsets that balance, disjoints the universe. From my perspective, this is the kind of negativity that comes to mind when I hear words like the mission system, sainthood, or Junipero Serra. I think of the ancestors, yours and mine, in the early days, before contact, before colonization, and how they were unrestrained. Unrestrained by the limits of linear time or of linear thinking, how they established life and order and continuity, how they sang their songs, how they evolved their languages and cultures and their consciousness, their indigeneity, and worldviews bonded to their homelands, suktuum, linked to a continuum of believing and being that were formed of red clay earth, or that we were from the stardust in the midnight sky, or how some of our peoples on this continent know that they came from the first foam that touched the shore, and others who know themselves as related to the dolphin, the bear, corn, or redwood tree, and how our destinies are tied together forever. I think of ancestors, yours and mine, and how they were unbounded by the confines of states, or governments, or policies, or museum displays, or academic theories, that today limit us, define us, confine us, ultimately suffocate us, they have to destroy us. I think there's a direct relationship between linear time, linear thinking, and this ongoing colonization. For my own people, the Ashiwi, first contact happened for us at Haiku in 1539, and it was a Franciscan, Denisa, and a Moor, Establanico, who had been enslaved. And here, in Chumash countries, not much later, because I was doing the research, I want to know who says they were here first. And it said 1542 on Cabrillo. So that close proximity of time in our respective people's histories, the 1500s, when peace was severed, when they came in robes, para robar, when the conquistadors invaded our territories, when they cut into our homelands, dismembered our ancestors, yours and mine, with swords, with reading, with God, that close proximity in the colonial history of this continent uniquely links my people and your people. Links us together. Because even though our nations and communities are thousands of miles apart in geography, shared a history. Our ancestors had a common and tragic experience of being one of the first in North America to see the glint of steel in the hot sun, to hear starved dogs barking, and to know the sound of orphan children crying. Think about that time, that first contact, the shock of it, the clash, the death. And in the wake of that invasion, in this ongoing process of colonization, because it is ongoing, we're in a settler colonial state. Colonization is not done with us. It is still happening. And that's an important thing for us to remember today. Especially in this time of universal fallacy and universal spin, when the truth has many enemies and lies have many friends. We are still being colonized. Just like we are not post-racial, we are not post-colonial. Because if we're really going to disrobe and tell the truth, then let's tell it. If we're sincerely wanting to reveal what that robe is hiding underneath, then now's the time. Why should we bite our tongues? Why should we hold back? What are we really afraid of? Ourselves? Are we afraid of each other? Are we afraid of freedom? Of liberation? From the narrow confines that are built around us, that we trap ourselves in? We have to let ourselves be courageous and face these issues and truly disrobe, dismantle all of those attachments. This is not out of the box thinking. There is no box. The box is a lie. The box is that myth. The box is doubt. The box is fear. The box is colonization. And we simply cannot stay within it anymore. It's not safe there, and it never was. The box is a construct that mirrors the mojineros. Mojineros, and I may not be pronouncing it, mojineros. It's a place. Native women and girls were held captive there and evangelized. Laced inside by fear, laced inside, shackled to the walls. This took place all over from what is known as Latin America, from what is known to be New Mexico, Arizona, and here in California. And within those confines of the mission system, where they were prepared to be of use to the church, they were taught to be a subject, to be a servant, to be a slave, to be a Christian life, within that narrow view of what a woman's destiny should be. Within that narrow view, that brutality was not solely about the women and the girls' indigenousness, their indigeneity, as much it was about their gender. And I think about that violence and how it's echoed continuously now in assault against our common Mother Earth. In my work, I've had the opportunity to travel, and I've seen these montañas, like the one in Ecuador. And I've been there, a windowless, monolithic structure, where on a cold night in an Andean city, when you walk past that building, you can still feel them, the anguished spirits in there, who were cloistered there against their will. It's like you could still hear them, crying and tearing at the walls with what was left of their fingernails. You could feel it. That place, the echo of the memories that it holds, has stayed with me for years. It couldn't have been any different here in California. It was no different in New Mexico. Same system, same priests, same mentality. Ravenous, ruthless, vicious. Who were the savages? The great devouring as the children of God have fed upon the children of earth, and called it civilization, and it hasn't stopped, it continues. An evil like that, it's like a shapeshifter, rotting flesh wrapped in another skin. In order to survive, it takes on new forms, it has new names. Today, I think the canonization of Junipero Serra is a form that it's taking now. It's an expression of it. But revealed, disrobed, we know it's the same lie. It's a great lie, and we've been lied to. And as John Trail says, the great lie is that it's civilization, and it's not civilized. It's been literally the most bloodthirsty, brutalizing system ever imposed upon this planet. That's not civilization, that's a great lie. The great lie is that it represents civilization. That's the great lie. If it does represent civilization, and that's truly what civilization is, and the great lie is that civilization is good for us. The lie has to succeed in order for mainstream society and the civilization paradigm of devouring, of taking, of consuming, not only of peoples, but of cultures and ecosystems through mega industrial development, mining, water diversion, dams, clear cutting, in the war against memory, in the war against the natural world, in the rape culture that is ravaging the planet. And most importantly, we have to believe it and we're complicit in it. In ravaging the native California world with establishing a mission system, including the whippings, the slavery, the destruction, the anguish, in fact, because of that worldview, that paradigm, Junipero Serra is really a hero. So I'll conclude. Because in this era of superhero culture, he's a superhero of the devouring world. And even as long ago passing, he's dead so long ago, his potential sainthood is a trigger, and it feeds on the bodies, minds, and memories of indigenous peoples here, north, south, west, east. And it feeds into the voracious, ever-open mouth of Anglo-Christian superiority. So what's the answer? Decolonization? Re-indigenization? It cannot be denied that there is a clear and direct relationship between Christianization and colonization. That means that true decolonization of our minds, of our bodies, of spirits, and of Mother Earth can only come then from de-Christianization. I know it hurts to hear. I know it's like a wound torn open. It's not about Junipero Serra, not exactly. It's about the great lie. And I mentioned that earlier, and we're pretending that it's true. It's about perpetuating that myth through its canonization, yes. It's about us staying quiet and about us staying complicit, us staying in the box, and allowing the continuation of that paradigm that changed the course of history of all of our lives. That from one that was of responsibility and reciprocity in the native paradigm of balance, to that of taking, devouring, and of never being full, never being satisfied, no matter how much is consumed, whether it's peoples, cultures, land, species, the whole earth. So our only option, individually and collectively, is decolonization.
Now you know why we wanted her. Our women lead us. But also, there's the voice of our men. Shannon Rivers, former chair of the Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus, United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We wanted to bring, it's not just a Chumash issue. It's not just a question of California, but a global issue. And that's why we invite our esteemed friend, a relative, Shannon Rivers.
Skugdash, Aniab Chugi, Bishop Bayak Miratum, Sapai Mashma. Sapai Mashma to the Chumash people. I want to recognize the people of this territory and their ancestors. I greet you in my language, the O'odham language, or the O'odham York. It is one of the most ancient languages in what we now call Arizona and northern Mexico. We recognize that I am here not by myself, but with my ancestors, the Hu'ugam, or what the archaeologists call the Hohokam, who lived along the river which is known as the Gila River. And they survived in the desert. I want to recognize that we're going to talk about ancestors, and when we do that, as indigenous people, we have to recognize that we are calling upon an ancient spirit. And we're going to talk in this term, in these English words about our ancestors, because all of us have been colonized to some degree. And I want to, first of all, it's important for me as an O'odham to tell you that where I come from because that's how we first acknowledge ourselves and then you in your territory, and that I am a visitor here. I am a guest in your territory. And I'm going to take you through a historical understanding of the mission system, the Spanish, and our relationship to the churches, and to the Roman Empire, and to the Catholics, and to the Christians. I am not Christian, I am not Catholic. My people have been Christianized and follow the Catholic religion very heavily. Where I come from is Gila River, Kuriakmur, the Old Man River. You now recognize it as Phoenix, Arizona. Arizona is actually an O'odham word, Arizona, meaning where all the little streams roll. Tucson is an O'odham word, Chukshan, the Black Mountains. Why is that important? Is first we have to identify where we come from. You call this place Santa Barbara, or whatever you call it. Some may call it a beautiful place, in which it is, but it's littered with settlers, newcomers. And our ancestors, whether we come from O'odham territory, are all over this place. There are bones, our relationship with this land. I come from a place called Ba'aki. Ba'aki in my language means medicine house. It is one of the oldest villages in our territory, several thousand years old. I know that you've been giving me this title, which I've held at the UN for a little while, for a couple of years, through the forcing of my friend, Tia, and the nomination by other indigenous peoples. I was thrust into the UN system because of 9/11. The militarization of our border began immediately. It always was there. The Gaston Purchase, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in the 1840s and 50s. Those things took place, but for the most part, the O'odham were pretty much left alone, for the most part. And when I went to the UN, it was about the concern that we had about the militarization of the border. And I'm going to try to, again, take you through this timeline, and I'm going to try to do it very fast for over the last 300 years. Our people were separated between this border, this man-made border. And now we see a wall that continues from California on down to Texas, where indigenous peoples are being impacted. For us, we have over 180,000 vehicles along that border. These are Border Patrol agents. 180,000. In the Tohono O'odham territory, first let me say that there are about 5 bands of O'odham, and we stretch from central Phoenix, or central Arizona, to about 800 miles into Mexico. We are a large group, our O'odham. We are known as the Onkakmerd O'odham, the Salt River, the Akmerd O'odham, the Gila River Indian community, the Tohono O'odham, the Hiache O'odham, the desert people, and I want you to remember that name for a second. And then our people further in the south, where in the mountains. About 800 miles is a long ways. The first contact that we had, that we know of, was Coronado in 1540. He arrived and immediately took slaves, and then he wrote back to the church that he was disappointed that he showed generosity to the indigenous peoples, but they would not take heed to his generosity, so he took slaves and killed many of them. The other person that came through in the 1680s was Father Kino. Now, why is that important? Today, we see many of these churches, these missions, and one of them to the furthest area of our territory, which is known as the Rim of Christendom, is in a place called Tucson, and it's the San Javier Mission. I'm sure some of you've heard of it. It's a very beautiful place in the middle of the desert. What you see inside the mission is a large painting of indigenous peoples building this mission. What you don't see in the picture is the slavery, the brutal oppression of the Oahu. And then finally, Serra, who came through, but specifically focused on San Diego and all the way up here to San Francisco, for the missions. What is the relationship with these people, and why is it important to talk about at an international level? Somebody mentioned the papal bulls and the doctrines of discovery. The papal bulls started around 1009. And those were edicts that were set out by the Vatican, the Pope. But the papal bulls that affect us immediately are the papal bulls of 1493 and the other ones that follow. And immediately, we as indigenous peoples were subjugated to cruelty immediately because we were considered pagans and Saracens. We did not believe in that religion or their ideology. And we were immediately assaulted, both physically, spiritually, mentally, psychologically, and sexually. We have to talk about that, because that's critically important to the ongoing trauma within indigenous communities. Not just here in the United States, but throughout Central and South America, and in fact throughout the world. We have areas of developing countries where the church immediately goes in and wants to help with the souls of the individuals. That still goes on today. I'm going to try to address really quickly the human rights aspect, and I want to try to address the word freedom. Many of you are not free. We are still connected to the chains of this trauma. And our sister here that read the poem was really amazing to me to hear. It's very, obviously very sad, but for me as an O'odham and as someone who was thrust into the UN system to take a position as a chairperson was to recognize that these things that take place, from the doctrines of discovery to the papal bulls, they continue to impact us today. I wear a couple of hats in Arizona. One is that my focus has been on the environmental impacts of indigenous people, land, water, land taking of land, clear cutting, as Tia mentioned, the reduction in our flora and our fauna. But in the United States, they say that there are about 562 recognized tribes, federally recognized. And at the table, we had a discussion about who should be, or people wanting federal recognition. I said, and my argument was that we have an inherent right as indigenous people. We don't need recognition. Our recognition is here. Our recognition exists long before America, long before the subjugation of our people and the imprisonment, both mentally and physically. It is longer and older than that. It is longer than that border that divides Mexico and the United States. And we have individual stories. Sadly, however, we share one story in common, and that's the trauma that was brought on by these newcomers. We call them Mirdagan, the people with very white skin, and that come from a different place. The the hats that I wear is that I work in the prison systems. I work in 2 large prisons. And I work in one county jail, and that is in Coconino County, which is now Flagstaff area. You may have heard of the fight of Go-Go-Shli, the San Francisco Peak, with the Navajo, the Dene, and the Hopi, and many of the 13 nations that fight to obtain rights to worship on that hill, on that mountain. Coconino County houses 54% Native American prisoners. 54%. That's a lot of prisoners. Most, of course, are there because of petty crimes, but they range from extreme violence to alcoholism and drug addiction to being a nuisance on the street. I tell you that because working in the prison system, I see the effects of colonization, forced relocation, and desperation of our Native men and women. I see the violence that continues to take place. I see the high death rates, the high unemployment rates. I see these things, and it's important for us as Native people, as I mentioned, is that we don't ask anyone for our rights. We have inherent rights. And how do we take that back? We come to a beautiful place like this. In fact, I spoke to about 4,000 Unitarian about a couple of years ago. I was in Arizona, and I don't know if our friends were there. Right? They were there, and they were very beautiful and very welcoming, but I said to them, do you know whose territory you're on? And many of them said no. They didn't know. And in fact, many of you know. Probably not. We're probably preaching to the choir here for a lot of the folks. I want to say that I don't denounce Christian or Catholicism, Christianity or Catholicism. I denounce the doctrine. And the doctrine is what's important. If we exist today and continue to exist because of Johnson v. McIntosh and because of the Supreme Court rulings, because of people who have federal recognition, and because we want that, I don't want that. I don't need that. I'm an indigenous person. I am an original person of the territories of Arizona. Those are my people. I need to, however, is to reach out to my friends, my brothers, my sisters, like you, to educate us on why we still remain oppressed, whether it's legally or religiously. And I want to try to end this to say that we have become sub-oppressors of our own people. We continually, and our sister mentioned it, that we fight amongst each other. The UN is a beast. It is a difficult place. This white hair, that's pretty new. And it's been a difficult time to remove the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the border patrols in our territory who continue to intimidate our people, driving fast through our territory, killing our people, shooting at innocent people. The oppression continues. And I want you to imagine this before I close, is I want you to look at your hand for a second. Just look at your hand for a minute. Some of you have older hands. They're weathered. Some of you have very beautiful hands, like myself. Look at your hand for a minute and imagine in that hand there's $1, there's a quarter, there's a peso, there is money. And every week you go to church and you are one of the poorest count on this electricity that mostly comes from indigenous communities, and the extraction continues. I'm not denouncing the religion. I'm denouncing the doctrine. And I ask you to stand up with us and fight that, the continued oppression of our people. It's not about Serra. It's not about Kino. It's not even about manifest destiny anymore. It is about the survival of our people. And we have to survive. And as long as we continue to feed these religions, we have to really take a look at ourselves and what level are we participating in the oppression of not only the people locally, but the people around the world. Religion, or churches, and large denomination of these churches are going into developing countries, in areas in Peru, in Bolivia, Africa, very isolated regions of Africa, and wanting to help the poor peasants. Remember that story? That's the same story, brothers and sisters. I don't know Jesus. I've never met him. And I'm sure that he would give his money to those that were hungry. At least from what I read about him. That he was a humble individual. He was a loving individual. And somewhere along the line, the story of him and his belief got skewed by us as humans, the two-legged. And we continue to destroy each other. And you, as an O'odham, because you are O'odham, you're a human being, you have to recognize that if you're participating in that, at some level, you have to stop. And we call on those churches and the Pope and all these churches that continue to do so. Leave the uncontacted people alone. Leave them alone. We have to maintain that. And if we have been contacted, let's try to reverse our thought process and our relationship that we have. It is a difficult thing. They didn't invite me up here to be nice. And I'm not nice. I speak very harshly too about the oppression of our people. I work in the prison system, and I see it every day. And I want our people free. I want true freedom, not only from those physical prisons, but the mental prisons that they exist in. Thank you very much.
To round off the discussion, the first panel, now you know why we banished Shannon, by the way. They wanted a powerful speaker and expressing some view of our own indigenous feelings and aspirations. When thinking about this last panelist, we were saying within our maritime culture, the homos, when the Lakas came down, when the Hokulea and the Kanakimali came down our coast, and then when we went to a demonstration in Oakland, which was led by indigenous people, 8,000 strong, marching against fracking, protecting our earth, mother, sky, water. One wants to think about right now the plant, animal, and insect life as being